This video is a deep dive into the poem's central figure. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca whose 10-year struggle to get home gives the whole epic its shape. By the time the Odyssey opens, Odysseus has already spent 10 years fighting at Troy and another 10 trying, and failing, to sail home, which means we meet him not as a fresh conqueror, but as a man worn down by 2 decades of obstacles. Everything the poem shows him doing from that point on is filtered through this exhaustion. He's resourceful because he has to be, guarded because trust has cost him before, and desperate for home in a way that colors nearly every choice he makes. It's worth noting, too, that Odysseus doesn't actually appear on stage for the poem's first several chapters. We hear about him secondhand, through Telemachus's search and the suitor's contempt, before the story finally shows him weeping alone on Calypso's shore. That delayed entrance builds him up as an absence the whole household is organized around before we ever see the man himself. The trait the poem returns to constantly is his cunning, his willingness to solve problems through intelligence and disguise rather than brute force alone. The clearest example is the trick he plays on Polyphemus the Cyclops. Trapped in a cave with a monster eating his men, Odysseus doesn't try to overpower him. He gets him drunk, tells him his name is nobody, and blinds him in his sleep, so that when the wounded Cyclops screams for help, his neighbors hear him shouting that nobody is attacking him and don't bother to come. It's a plan built entirely on wordplay and patience rather than strength, and it works. That same instinct shows up again and again, disguising himself as a beggar to scout his own palace, holding his emotions in check while suitors mock him to his face, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal himself. It shows up earlier in his journey, too, when Circe threatens to turn him into an animal like the rest of his crew. He doesn't fight her directly, but uses a protective herb given to him in advance and forces her onto his own terms instead, turning a magical threat into an alliance. When his ship approaches the sirens, he doesn't simply avoid the danger. He finds a way to experience it safely, having himself bound to the mast so he can hear their song without steering the crew to their deaths. Where a more conventional hero might charge in, Odysseus studies the situation first and looks for the angle that lets him survive it. But the poem is careful not to make him flawless, and his pride is the trait that most consistently undoes him. Right after escaping Polyphemus's island, with his ship already safely away, Odysseus can't resist shouting his real name back at the wounded giant to claim credit for the trick. It's a small, human moment of wanting to be known for his own cleverness, and it's catastrophic. Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon, and that single boast is what turns the sea god into a personal enemy who delays Odysseus's return by years. The pattern repeats in smaller ways throughout his journey. His curiosity nearly gets his men killed at the Cyclops' cave in the first place, since he insists on waiting to meet their host rather than simply taking supplies and leaving. And that same restlessness later leads his men to open the bag of storm wines out of suspicion he never quite manages to put to rest. Odysseus's intelligence and his pride aren't separate traits. They're two sides of the same need to be recognized as exceptional, and the poem keeps testing whether he can learn to set that need aside when it threatens him. It's worth noting that Odysseus's cunning has real limits, and the poem doesn't pretend otherwise. On the island of Thrinacia, home to the sun god's sacred cattle, Odysseus extracts a promise from his starving crew not to touch the animals, then falls asleep, exhausted, at exactly the wrong moment. His men slaughter the cattle anyway, and the entire crew is destroyed in the storm that follows, leaving Odysseus as the only survivor. It's one of the few moments in the poem where his usual vigilance simply isn't enough, a reminder that even his formidable self-control has a breaking point, and that some disasters in this story happen not because he fails to plan, but because he can't be everywhere at once managing men who are hungry, frightened, and increasingly desperate after years away from home. That tension drives his development across the epic. Early in his wandering, restraint doesn't come naturally to him at all. By the poem's final stretch, something has clearly shifted. Returning to Ithaca in disguise, Odysseus endures years of accumulated insult without breaking. The suitors abuse him, mock his appearance, and he absorbs it silently, waiting for the right moment rather than reacting to every provocation. When his own dog, Argus, recognizes him and dies moments later, Odysseus doesn't dare show emotion in front of the suitors, even in a moment of real grief. This is a version of Odysseus who has learned, through hard experience, exactly what his earlier boasting cost him, and who now treats patience as a weapon rather than a weakness. Even when his old nurse Eurycleia recognizes a scar on his leg while washing his feet, he reacts fast and physically, seizing her and demanding silence, rather than losing control of the situation the way his younger self might have let a moment of shock spill over into carelessness. The contest of the bow is the payoff of that whole arc. Rather than announcing himself the moment he arrives home, he waits until the suitors have exhausted themselves failing, strings the bow quietly, and only then reveals who he is, at the exact moment it does the most damage. Even his final proof of identity to Penelope depends on the same restraint rather than force. Instead of insisting she simply accept him, he lets her test him, and it's his genuine, unrehearsed reaction to her trick about their marriage bed, not a demand or a threat, that finally convinces her. That willingness to be tested, rather than simply believed on his own authority, marks a real shift from the man who once couldn't resist shouting his name at a wounded Cyclops purely to be recognized. All of this feeds the central debate critics still have about Odysseus. Is he ultimately a hero to admire, or is his cunning closer to manipulation and even outright cruelty? The strongest case for the hero reading rests on everything he endures and overcomes for the sake of getting home to his family, and on how the poem consistently rewards his patience once he learns to exercise it. His restraint under the suitor's insults is framed as strength, not weakness, and the poem clearly wants us on his side as he waits out their mockery. The case for a darker reading points to the brutality of his homecoming. The mass killing of the suitors is followed by the execution of the household maids who'd slept with them, a punishment the poem narrates with unsettling detail and little sympathy for the women involved, who had far less power in that household than the suitors did, and arguably far less choice in the matter as well. Some readers see this as justice restoring order after a genuine, prolonged violation of Odysseus's household. Others see a man whose cleverness curdles into something closer to vengeance once he finally has the power to act on it, punishing those with the least power to resist him alongside those who actually wronged him. The poem itself doesn't fully resolve this tension, and it's worth remembering that ancient and modern audiences don't necessarily land on the same side of it. What a Bronze Age audience may have read as fitting justice, a modern reader often finds far more troubling. That gap is exactly why Odysseus remains one of the most argued-over heroes in ancient literature, not because he's simple to judge, but because he refuses to be.